know the story of David and Goliath, right, Taplines listener? Even if you're a rock-ribbed atheist, I bet you do. The idea of a tiny hero fighting and righteously conquering a seemingly invincible foe has long since transcended religion to enter the American cultural lexicon. In the 80s and 90s, as the first wave of microbrewers from across the country started gaining traction with full-flavored beers, contemporary media reports and industry insiders alike adopted the David and Goliath framing to describe an antagonistic relationship between the nation craft movement and the corporate giants of big beer. Like any good parable, it was illuminating and compelling and maybe a little bit reductive too. In episodes 33 and 34, we examine this us versus them dynamic from the perspective of one of the thems, Keith Villa, who created the Blue Moon Brewing Company from within the Coors Colossus in the mid-90s. Today, we're coming at it once again through the eyes of Mitch Steele, a towering figure in the craft brewing industry who did a substantial stretch, semi-concurrent to Villa's at Coors, at Big Beer's biggest and baddest Goliath of all, Missouri's pre-InBev Anheuser-Busch. Mitch, who started his career at a Central California brew pub and would follow his time at AB with a long run at San Diego's Stone Brewing Company before co-founding New Realm Brewing Company in Atlanta in 2016, wound up in St. Louis towards the end of the 20th century on a Skunkworks-style R&D team tasked with brewing up answers to those pesky microbrews that would somehow satisfy distributors in the mighty Red Network, the American drinking public, and August Busch III himself. No mean feat. Would creative extensions on the premium Michelob line do the trick? Would a new brand named for AB's hop farm in northern Idaho? You'll have to listen to find out. It's Mitch Steele, it's Michelob Honey Lager and Elk Mountain Amber, it's inside Anheuser-Busch's microbrewing Skunkworks, and it's all right here, right now, on Vine Pair's Taplines. Mitch Steele, welcome to the Taplines studio, my man.
Yeah, thank you, Dave.
The virtual studio, obviously, listener. Mitch is not here with me. I'm recording here in Richmond, Virginia. Mitch, where are you joining us from today?
I'm in Atlanta, Georgia today.
And Mitch, you've got you had a busy week. You had some stuff going on at the brewery you currently work at. Of course, we're going to be talking about one of the breweries you previously worked at. But Mitch, you're at New Realm now. You're the brewmaster at New Realm. What's going on at New Realm this week?
Well, this week we had something pretty special going on. We were doing a collaboration brew with my really good friend Megan Parisi, who works at Samuel Adams. She runs the tap room at Faneuil Hall, and I've known Megan for a long, long time. We've judged together many, many times at GABF and World Beer Cup. And, 10 years or so ago, we had brewed a beer together with Tanya Cornett when I was at Stone. And when I went to New Realm, we had been talking for years about trying to do it again, and we finally made it happen. And then we also brought in a mutual friend of ours, Amé Munker from John I. Haas Hop Company, and Amé was able to help supply some hops for the collaboration brew. So we had a fun day, and I was able to take them to some great spots in Atlanta while they were here. So a good couple of days, definitely.
What, I hear you might have made it around to one of the iconic still going beer bars that's still out there pouring. Tell our listeners where you made it out the other day.
Yeah, we were last night. We were at the Brick Store Pub in Decatur, Georgia. It's about 5 miles from our brewery and about 5 miles from my house, actually. So it's
nice.
It is my favorite beer bar in the area. Probably in at least my top 5, if not my top 2 in the country. I just love that place. Last night they were doing a special event. They have a cask room now, where they have 4 beers on. Pouring as real ale all the time, and one of those beers is always Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. And last night, Sierra Nevada supplied casks dry hopped with 4 different hop varieties. So normally they dry hop it with Cascade, but they had Chinook, they had Comet, and they had Citra versions of their cask beer. So there was a huge crowd in there. A lot of brewers were in there. A lot of the Atlanta beer community. It was a really special night, and I was really happy to be able to take Megan there because she had never been there, and Amay loves the place. He goes there every time he's in town, visiting breweries. So it was a great night.
Man, I've been to Brick Store only once before, but I always had a real treat. Listeners of a certain age who have been in the game for a little while, I bet have made it there as well. But for those who haven't, it is an essential stop. It's one of the all timers, and you got to go out and sort of support these places because beer bars are it's a tough business to be in, but they're making it work at Brick Store.
Yeah, they really are. It's a wonderful spot, wonderful people. They've really done something special there, and I just there's a lot of places I could have lived when I moved to Atlanta, and I'm really, really glad I picked a place that was really close. So.
I bet. So, Mitch, we had you on today. We're delighted to have you here, and it strikes me that you're a man who's worked at breweries or brewing companies that have multiple locations. Of course, New Realm has multiple locations. Stone has multiple locations. And the brewery before that you worked at, a little bit bigger, but also has multiple locations. Of course, I'm talking about Anheuser-Busch. This is pre-InBev days. This is Anheuser-Busch AB that we're talking about. And they've got multiple locations as well, Mitch. But what we do here at Taplines is we hand the Taplines time machine over to our guest to select maybe a year that they think is the right time, to bring us back to where this story should start. And of course, as we've chatted about before we got on the podcast today, I want to talk about your time in the specialty brewing group in this Skunkworks division at Anheuser-Busch, trying to figure out this micro thing that was going on at the time. Mitch, in your mind, what year do you think is appropriate to scroll back to?
I think 1995 would be the year.
Okay, we're midway through the 90s, 1995. Where are we, Mitch? Where are you in 1995?
Well, when this all started, I was not part of the initial group that started it. So I was a brewing supervisor in Fort Collins, Colorado. The group was based out of St. Louis. And the work was being done there in the corporate brewing offices and the marketing department. And I joined probably about 6 months into the creation of the specialty brewing group.
Mm-hmm. What was your relationship with beer as a consumer product at that point? Obviously, you're working in the beer industry. I presume you're drinking beer at the time, but what was your awareness for the marketplace at that time when you were working in Fort Collins?
Well, I started off as a craft brewer in a little brew pub in central coastal California. And ever since I tasted Sierra Nevada, I was a craft beer guy. So there were some really good brew pubs and breweries in Fort Collins, and I was a big fan of New Belgium and Odell and Coopersmith's brew pub in Fort Collins. I was working at the brewery. I was learning how to evaluate on a sensory basis Budweiser and the Anheuser-Busch brand. So I was kind of all over the map. We did get free beer at Anheuser-Busch, and I had Budweiser in my refrigerator, but I also was a very frequent visitor to stores that carried really interesting craft beer selections in Fort Collins as well, and there were plenty of those. So I had a pretty mixed bag in my refrigerator.
Yeah. What was your sense of at that time, the microbrewing, I guess is what we were still calling it, what folks were still calling it back then, craft beer. What was your sense for how your colleagues or how others in the quote unquote mainstream beer industry thought of these smaller, often tiny little operations? Was it derision? Was it interest, curiosity? How do you remember how are they perceived at that time?
Yeah, I think it was a mix of curiosity, fandom in some cases, for people like me and some of my coworkers at the supervisory level. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a lot of derision. I think it was, if there was anything negative from some of the higher ups at AB, it was just lack of interest and just not feeling that it was anything really, really significant, and that was something that was that was something that I worked on when I actually did go over to the corporate side and work in St. Louis and start working on new products, was just building awareness among the Anheuser-Busch brewing team. But yeah, I think, it was a mix. I know the brewing supervisors and some of the folks on the brewing management side in the Fort Collins Brewery had really good relationships with the craft brewers in the area, and would offer assistance and help them out, we'd offer to do lab analysis on their beers and things like that. So, it was a pretty good relationship. I think it was just a question of how serious the folks at Anheuser-Busch took these upstart breweries.
Yeah. What were they? What were the top brass, August Busch the third, Three Sticks, and other folks that we've talked about? What were they taking seriously at that time? What was top of mind as you remember it from the corporate offices in St. Louis?
Oh, they paid very close attention to what Miller was doing at the time, and Coors. They were two separate companies back then, of course.
Sure. Way back when, yeah.
But those were the ones that were on the big radar. That was the competition, and then later on, Sam Adams started to gain some awareness and got on their radar as well. Boston Beer Company. But when I was in Fort Collins, it was mostly about paying attention to what Miller and Coors were doing in the market and new beers and things like that.
Sure, because if this was 1995, we're still. Only 13 years removed from Budweiser Light when it first came out. It had, full name, and then they shortened it, I think, in 84. Listener, if you're interested in hearing more about how that came to be, I urge you to go back and check out our episodes with historian Maureen Ogle, author of Ambitious Brew. We talked about the light beer wars. You can go find those in your podcast feed. But Mitch, when do you move over from Fort Collins to St. Louis?
So I started in Fort Collins in 1992, and I moved to St. Louis in 1995, in the spring of 1995. And that's when I started. My official title was manager of new products or something like that. But I moved. It was a corporate brewing department that was called Brewing Process Technology. And this was kind of a cross-functional department headed by a man named Mike Myers, who I really enjoyed working with. He was a very smart individual. He really worked hard, but his group kind of did a bunch of different things in the corporate brewing department, and they did a lot of engineering work. There was a gentleman there who was the expert on water and water supply at all the breweries and water chemistry and things like that. There were people there that worked on, capital expansion projects in the breweries. Control systems, those automation systems, things like that. So I was working with a really smart group of people. And then there were two of us that were assigned to new product development and working with the marketing team in that group, which was a bit, it was interesting because we didn't really, our skill set really wasn't the same as the other people in the group, but it was a great group to work with for sure.
Yeah, that's an interesting. And what was the name of the team again?
It was Brewing Process Technology. So basically anything that was kind of being developed as a new development, whether it was engineering process, it included brewing technology as well. That was all spearheaded by people in that group.
Yeah, it sounds like it had a pretty broad remit too. I mean, some of the disciplines that you're describing do not have a whole lot in common with one another.
No, but we all worked really well together. It was a great group of people. I was in that group for about 4 years, and it was tremendous fun.
Brewing Process Technology. I like that because it also sounds like a CIA front group, like it's they have like one office and there's butcher paper over the front glass door so you can't see in. Yeah. It's just a mailing address. Yeah.
Yeah, it was double top secret, definitely.
So you enter the corporate brewing department or division at Anheuser-Busch. This is the mothership in St. Louis. This is, we've talked about this in different episodes on this show here on Taplines, and of course, there's a lot of reporting. Would you say that this was, obviously in hindsight, we have the benefit of it now, was this like sort of as, Anheuser-Busch was close to the zenith of its might at that point, right? This is the heyday.
Yeah. it was definitely.
Yeah. What was that like? I mean, it had to feel like getting called up to the majors a little bit to be brought to St. Louis.
Oh, it definitely did. It was, I'd been with the company for 3 years. I had gone through a 1 month brewing school, and I did very well in that class. They quizzed us every morning, and I did really well. And I think that caught the attention of some folks. And the fact that I, was coming into Anheuser-Busch with 4 years of being a pub brewer under my belt, I think also caught the attention of some folks. But yeah, when I got called up there, I remember when we finished the class, and they went through and they kind of ranked, they announced who did really well in the class, and there was about 5 of us that got called out for doing that. One of the people that was in the school with me said, "Dude, you better start packing your bags. You're going to be going to St. Louis." And he was absolutely right.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was intimidating as all get out. I mean, I was working with some incredibly talented people who had been there for years. I was probably 33 years old at the time.
Wow.
I had been, working for 9 or 10 years or so, but this company was the biggest company I'd ever worked for, the most widespread, the most technically advanced company I'd ever worked for as well. And, you walk into a meeting room and there's a bunch of, 40 and 50-year-old German and American brewmasters who are among the most talented and skilled brewmasters on the planet. And yeah, you're going to be pretty intimidated, again, it was a great thing to walk into, but I was incredibly nervous about this situation because we were, the work that we were doing when we got into doing the new beers and everything, it was incredibly high visibility, up through the executive level of the company. So that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about this work that you're doing inside the brewing process technology division. At some point, the unit that you wind up on becomes called Specialty Brewing Group, right? When did that come along?
That came along before I got there.
Okay, so it already existed.
Yeah, and it was not really like a group of people huddled in a room coming up with ideas for new beers. It was the 2 people in the brewing process technology group who handled the brewing development projects, and then the marketing team. And we worked very closely with, the marketing team was a standalone specialty brewing group team, but we were the 2 brewing people that were part of the team. And so, we met a lot with the marketing folks, and we had a lot of planning discussions and things like that. But, it was interesting because, I didn't go in there with any preconceived notions that we were going to have 100% creative freedom to make new beers for Anheuser-Busch.
Yeah.
I had gotten the scoop from people, when I interviewed, and also the brewmaster in Fort Collins kind of laid it out for me before I went, so I wouldn't have any unrealistic expectations. But, Anheuser-Busch is a marketing-driven company, and so the marketing team is deciding and asking us to brew certain things.
Sure.
And then our job was to get it executed and developed and released and out the door. But, we did have a fair amount of input into those beers and how they were going to be made and what malts, what ingredients we were going to use and things like that. And so, it was an interesting dynamic for sure. And I had never worked with marketing people like that before in any of my previous jobs. So that was eye-opening for me for sure.
I bet. What was the ask, Mitch, when you came in? What was the mandate for you working with the marketing team within this larger division? Obviously, they knew you had experience at the Northern California brew pub that you worked at. Then you come into the AB system and you get experience in Fort Collins. You do well on the test. That you want to come in and brew stuff that they want. To your recollection, what did they want?
So at the time, we were in the middle of developing some new beers. Some of the new beers had already come out. So when I got there, they had released Elk Mountain Amber and Elk Mountain Red, and they had released a beer called Red Wolf and a a German wheat beer that was called Crossroads, a Hefeweizen. And those were the beers that were out there. And Michelob Amber Bock was just wrapping up right when I got there. And so, my job was to step in on anything that was unfinished, and help with that. And the person I was working with, his name was Paul Mancuso. He was already there and working on the project, so he just kind of took me under his wing and got me involved so that we could continue the work that had already been started. And my predecessor in the group, his name is Danny Kahn, and he had been promoted to work with the VP of Brewing. And so I filled his slot, and he was still involved quite a bit too. So we came in. I'm trying to remember what we were working on. I think we were just finishing up Michelob Amber Bock, and then we were doing some work to promote the Elk Mountain brands, which were still really new at the time. They had just been released right before I got there, so. I started doing some marketing work and working with the team and being kind of the representative of the brand, from the brewing side, and doing some media events and things like that. And so I had to go through media training, which was incredibly valuable. It was hard, I mean, bet, yeah, but they were really good at it. And so, they put you through these interviews and, ask you all these rough questions and then critique your responses and how you responded and everything. And I learned how to do it with that. The interesting thing is the way it worked is we had desk jobs. Paul and I were sitting at a desk, and so we'd go to meetings, and there were meetings every week regarding new releases and getting them out the door with a cross-functional group. And then we also were sending recipes over to the pilot brewery in the main St. Louis brewery. And there was they called it the Research Pilot Brewery, or the RPB, and it was a 10-barrel system. And they did a lot of work for Anheuser-Busch III, with hop evaluations, malt evaluations, and things like that. But we got one brewing slot a week to send them a recipe. And so we worked really closely with the team in the pilot brewery, and also the person in corporate brewing who was responsible for writing up what we called specials, or the test brews that went out into the big systems. So, it was a lot of administrative work, but it was also very creative work. And, the one thing that was interesting is this was a time when the internet was just starting.
Sure.
And so one of the things that I did is I did a lot of beer research and style research on the internet. And I tell people all the time, I learned more about beer styles in 3 years at Anheuser-Busch than I had ever learned before. Even though I was a craft brewer and everything, and a home brewer and all this stuff, I learned a tremendous amount just because we wanted to have that base knowledge if the marketing team ever came calling.
Sure. There's something counterintuitive about the idea that Anheuser-Busch, at the height of its power, it's the biggest brewer in the country. It has virtually limitless tank space to brew whatever it wants, and they gave you one brewing slot on a 10-barrel system a week?
Yeah.
Boy, they didn't think much of this project you were working on.
It was funny. Shortly after I got there, it was like I said before, it was kind of a balance between whether to take it seriously or not. And I remember early on proposing that we have a taste panel to taste craft beer at Anheuser-Busch. And
how'd that go over?
Well, it was interesting. One of the directors of brewing, his name was Heinrich Heisinger, talked to me about it, and he said, I really admire your initiative here. This is the kind of thing we want people to do. And he said, I don't want you to get your hopes up. But we did it. We did have the panel, and it turned into kind of the B-level panel. It wasn't the heavy hitters in corporate brewing that were tasting these beers, but it was the people that were involved to some extent with new product development, and some people. There was a Anheuser-Busch had a group called, it was the technical center, so it was people that ran the labs and everything, and they had a couple of people that worked with us very closely as well. And so we had a good group that got together every week, and in my travels, I'd pick up bottles of craft beer and bring them back with me, and we'd put them on the panel and taste them. And so, we were doing it, but it wasn't, it probably didn't make the impact that I think I initially had hoped it would. But
Yeah.
But the beers, really, people would take them seriously if they did well, or if they got, if they were well received, and a lot of this came from asks from Anheuser-Busch wholesalers who were, craft beer was starting to make an impact on their ability to sell the beers they were carrying, and
Sure.
they would ask for, for Anheuser-Busch to supply some beers to compete with some of the beers that were out there.
Yeah. What do you remember, to the extent that you recall, the quality being like amongst the beers that you sourced for these tasting panels? I mean, obviously now talking in 2024, craft brewing has come a tremendously long way. We're almost 30 years exactly away from the period we're talking about. What was quality like back then? I mean, were people hitting profiles properly? Like, was there a lot of hop burn? Was there a lot, like, talk us through, to the extent again, I know this is a while ago, but like, what was going on with the beers that you were tasting?
I think it was a bit of a mixed bag. But I think the biggest problem that with the beers that we were bringing into those panels, with a lot of them were oxidized. They just weren't packaged well. As far as the recipe and the ingredients that went into them, there were a lot of really interesting beers and a lot of really hop forward beers that I really liked.
Yeah.
But when I bring in a stout, I remember people saying, "Oh, this tastes like an electrical fire. This is just brutal." Or the soy sauce stout, character and things like that.
Yeah.
So it was all over the place. But I tried to pick beers that were doing well in their markets. Harpoon IPA, I know, made that panel. Gosh, what's the one from Minnesota? Summit, their lager or Pilsner.
Summit,
I know that made that panel, so a lot of beers from California, because that's where I'm from. And so I went back, for vacation and things, and I'd load up beers. So, I tried to, Anchor and Sierra Nevada, obviously, were part of it. And we just wanted to have kind of as a group, an understanding of what the beers in the market actually tasted like, because, it's, you need to have that knowledge. You need to understand what people are making before, when somebody comes and asks you to make something to, that's, a pale ale or a wheat beer or whatever. Yeah, you need to know what those beers are supposed to taste like, right?
Sure.
So, it was an interesting process. And, some people took it very seriously and really enjoyed it. And other people thought of it more of a task, and that's okay.
It takes all kinds, I suppose. Tell us a little bit more about the dialogue, or maybe it wasn't a dialogue, maybe it was more of a one-way conversation, but the relationship between your team, your two-man team, you and Paul Mancuso, and the marketing team who's interfacing maybe with the wholesalers, interfacing with retailers, going out and doing focus groups and hearing what people want to drink. They come back with ideas, and I think a lot of folks who listen to this podcast have had some experience in the craft brewing industry and know the feeling of a marketing team or a marketer, kind of asking for, hey, wouldn't it be great if we did this? And I know a lot of brewers have bristled at that dynamic nowadays in the more modern era. I'm curious, I mean, you made the point earlier in the conversation that Anheuser-Busch is this marketing machine. I mean, it is a marketing company. The product is beer, obviously, but that's the muscle, right? And what was that dynamic like? And sort of how did you take what you were hearing from them and put it into beers that you could actually stand behind?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there were some people that were part of the specialty brewing group that were on the marketing side that really wanted to work with us. And not have us work for them. So it was, they respected our opinions. And, when they said, hey, we're getting killed by this beer up in New England, can you guys make something like that? Can the company make something like that? and we'd have a discussion about it and what we wanted the beer to be, and it was interesting. The Elk Mountain beers were not patterned off anything. That was just the marketing team came together with the brewing team and said, "Look, we want a hoppy ale, and we want a lager to go along with that because we're a lager brewery." And it was that kind of a conversation. And then it was sitting at a table and maybe tasting some beers and talking about beers and then coming to some sort of consensus on how to approach the brewing of these. And then we would go and get the pilot brews done, bring the pilot brews back and taste them with the marketing team. If they passed, that level, then it went up several levels through management up into the executive level before it got actually approved to brew. So that was an agonizing part of the process. But there were a couple of different marketing groups that were working on new products. There was like a marketing group that was more innovation focused, and kind of thinking out of the box. And then there was the people in the specialty brewing group that were much more focused on making really, really good examples of what was being done in the craft world.
Yeah.
And so we had to deal with both of that. The innovation group was a little more challenging to work with because they would, out of the box, and, brewers are not out of the box thinkers with,
Right.
I mean, we are, but we're not, I mean, if it takes it out of traditional brewing, then you tend to push back a little bit.
Well, and especially this was in the mid 90s too. You didn't have the benefit of learning from peers and learning yourself over the course of the ensuing 30 years of craft beer becoming more of a thing and experimenting, small batch stuff becoming more of a thing. You were swinging for for far fences at that point, because ideally they wanted you to come up with stuff that was going to make it work throughout the Red Network, man. Like it can't be just, kind of oddball stuff. It's hard to think that way, or it's hard to think both ways, I imagine. Yeah,
it is. We had some pretty interesting requests, and I do have to say that the folks in the specialty brewing group, and the other thing that was challenging there was marketing people tended to rotate through jobs pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah.
When somebody is part of the specialty brewing group, the first group of people that were on the marketing side that we worked with, they got moved out about a little over a year after I got into the group. And then we had to learn how to work with a bunch of new folks. And these new folks, they didn't want to necessarily push for what had been done in the past, especially since it probably wasn't working as well as people thought it should have been. They wanted to reinvent the wheel.
Sure.
So, that's kind of how we went from Elk Mountain family of beers and then went into the Michelob family of beers. So there was that dynamic too.
Well, let's talk about where Michelob was at this time. Obviously, contemporarily, 2 decades into the 21st century, Michelob Ultra is on a rocket ship and has been more or less since it was introduced in 2002, I want to say it came out. Mm-hmm. But it really has come on strong over the back half of last decade and into this one, the 2020s. But Michelob, many younger listeners will not necessarily realize this, but Michelob is a long and storied brand family that vastly predates Michelob Ultra. Where was Michelob the brand at in its life cycle when you entered the scene, when you started working on it?
So Michelob was, I want to say it was still a pretty strong brand for Anheuser-Busch. Michelob was kind of the super premium lager that Anheuser-Busch, to use that lingo that all the big brewers use.
And they had the great bottle, a very distinctive bottle with those shoulders.
With the shoulders. It was probably the most European-influenced beer that Anheuser-Busch made, traditional European beer. There was a time when Michelob first came out, and long throughout its history, it was an all-malt beer. And then, most of the beers at Anheuser-Busch were brewed with either rice or with corn. The Budweiser brand was always rice as an adjunct, and some of the other brands like Busch and Natural Light used corn. Michelob was used when I got to Anheuser-Busch, used rice, but a very small percentage compared to Budweiser. It was probably 50% of what of the recipe that Budweiser had as far as the amount of rice. But Michelob had a pronounced hop character for a long time. It was using it was brewed with Czech Saaz hops. So it had some, in my mind, it had some credibility as kind of a nice European styled lager. It was in the same camp as Lowenbrau and, some of those beers that were, kind of the special beers you'd get when you have a special occasion. But Michelob I believe had been tailing off a little bit, and there was, we had some success in Texas with a kind of an American Bock beer that was called Ziegenbock, and it was sold only in Texas. And right about the time that I was moving to St. Louis, the company had made the decision to take that beer nationwide, but they didn't want to call it Ziegenbock because Ziegenbock was firmly planted and rooted in Texas. So they decided to make it a Michelob brand extension. And there was Michelob Classic Dark back then at the time, which was a dark lager. And Michelob Amber Bock kind of fell in between the Michelob Classic Dark and the standard Michelob beer as far as flavor profile, color, and things like that. And, it was the one that really took off. Red Wolf was really taking off. That was an amber lager. And there was talk about the time we were realizing that the Elk Mountain brands weren't going to be as successful as we had hoped they would be. There was a lot of discussion with the brewing team and the marketing team about doing brand extensions off Red Wolf or doing more brand extensions off Michelob. And in the end, they decided to focus on Michelob because of the heritage of that brand within Anheuser-Busch and with the people that drink Anheuser-Busch beers. So that's what we did.
What were some of the beers that you wound up extending off of the Michelob brand?
We did that. There were a lot of them to start with.
Yeah.
So first off, we did a couple of like Christmas beers that were Michelob, labeled beers. But then when we decided to make the full-on push for Michelob, we had to develop, I think, 5 or 6 different beers, all in a very short time frame. It was a major initiative within the company. We did a pale ale, and it's interesting because we still had Elk Mountain at the time, and Elk Mountain was a pretty deep amber ale. And so the pale ale, I wanted to make sure that it was differentiated enough. And it turned into more of a golden pale ale. It didn't have a lot of crystal malt in it. It wasn't as amber colored as Sierra Nevada pale ale, for example. It had a really nice hop character. We did a Pilsner. We did a porter. Let's see, what else did we do? We were working on a red lager at the time, or an amber lager. Boy, I know I'm missing 1 or 2 of them. But
what about does a honey
yes.
one ring a bell? Does that
the honey
one was
lager,
pretty big,
Michelob
right?
honey lager? Yeah, that was probably the most successful of them. And that was that was a fun one because I didn't know anything about brewing with honey, and Anheuser-Busch was associated with Eagle Snacks at the time.
Sure, right.
And so we reached out to the folks at Eagle Snacks and said, "Hey, where are you getting your honey for the honey roasted peanuts that are Eagle Snacks?" And they told us it was some place up in Michigan. And so we went up to Michigan and inspected the place, and it was really dirty. And there were like rusty drums out in their yard that they were filling with honey, and we're like, when we were doing things like this, we always kind of had in the back of our mind, what would August Busch III say if he saw
that
this?
was what I was about to ask. Famously fastidious, would inspect his brew houses and be upset if he saw a broom out of place. So
yes, exactly. So we quickly pivoted and tried to find another source of honey, and we found we started working with Sioux Honey out of Iowa. And you walked into their facility and it was spotless, and they had people in lab coats, and it was like an Anheuser-Busch brewery at the level of that cleanliness.
Yeah.
And they were great to work with. They created a special blend of honey for us for the beer. And, and I remember we were brewing this in Fort Collins, and I still had a relationship.
At this point, they're giving you more tank space than just that one slot on the 10-barrel system.
Yeah, this was a big project. So we got a lot of slots in the pilot brewery to do prototypes, and then we were able to take them out to the main breweries and run test brews. And I remember the team in Fort Collins. I went out there, when we did the first one, and we were adding the honey in the brew house, and to try and sterilize the honey, keep it on the hot side. And the team kind of ganged up on me and they said, "Don't you dare make us put honey in the finishing in the bright beer." And, we got through the fermentation and the lagering, and they processed the beer to bright, and it didn't have enough honey character. And I had to call them up and say, folks, we're going to have to put honey in this bright beer. And my ass got chewed up and down, and these guys knew me. So part of it was the fact that they knew what, I was putting them into a pretty difficult position because, at Anheuser-Busch, the finishing cellars are kept at like 35 degrees. I mean, the whole cellar is ice cold, and to try and work with honey at that temperature was just unrealistically difficult. We had to get pumps and special pumps to pump it, and then there was concerns about the microbial stability because honey is notoriously full of microbes and spores and things like that. So I don't think they ever forgave me for that one, but
but the beer was popular.
The beer was popular. That was probably the most popular of the set. And, the Pilsner was my favorite. And we called it Michelob Golden Pilsner, and it was 35 IBUs. And, it got to the point where the people on the executive and, director and vice president level folks in the corporate brewing world came back to me, and we were in taste panel, and they said, "This beer's too bitter. It's too bitter." And I said, "No, it's not.
At 35 IBUs.
It's perfect. It's perfect. It's a German Pilsner, and we had to drop the bitterness on it. And we were brewing that one in Fort Collins too. And my old boss at Fort Collins called me and said, "What the hell are you doing with this Pilsner? It was perfect." And I said, "It's not my call. I tried. I fought for it, but
yeah, that's got to be frustrating." Talk a little bit more about that dynamic, if you would. I mean, this is the early days or not like the early days, but we're in, maybe what people would call in hindsight the first wave of craft brewing, right? It starts to boom in the late 90s and then hits a slump in the very late 90s and early 2000s. But there was not nearly the level of institutional buy-in within the industry for these types of more challenging flavor profiles. And I'm curious, you're more on the cutting edge, right, at that time and today even, because you're still working in the business. But that this beer is good. Your boss knows, and this is challenging. It's exciting. It's new. It's different. You really think you nail it. And then word comes down from up on high that we're not going to move forward with that. That's gotta be frustrating. Talk us. I mean, if you remember at the time, or as much as you can remember at the time, what did that feel like?
Oh, it was very frustrating. I mean, there were a lot of battles that we lost, and that was one of them. There were some other beer instances, doing a special release and having two prototypes, and we were heavily in the camp of one of them, and the other one is the one that got selected. And the one thing that I was told and that I learned in Anheuser-Busch was when you're in a role like mine and you're at a level in the company like mine with several layers above me, state your objection, be calm about it, but don't beat on it again if you're told no. It's not a good look. It's not a good move for you professionally to do that. So state your opinion, state your objection, be calm about it. And if the decision is made to go in a different direction, just move on.
Yeah.
And, it's, I've kind of held on to that because I do think that was pretty valuable advice. And I try not to get too emotionally attached to things. I remember at Stone, I was, I didn't want to reformulate Stone Pale Ale, and I was fighting for it. And Steve Wagner who formulated that beer originally, the president of Stone Brewing Company, told me I had to lose my emotional attachment to the beer. And, and it was kind of that same thing. You can't, if you're running a smaller brewery or you're a one man or, a small operation, you can get emotionally attached to the beer.
Sure.
But when you're in a bigger company, a lot of people have a lot of say, and, you just got to learn how to navigate that. And it's tough. There were a lot of those instances where we made decisions that I 100% disagreed with, but we did it anyway, and it was my job to execute it. I remember we did in the pilot brewery, one of the things that we did as I got comfortable with the whole process and the systems, we decided we were going to try to make a version of every classic beer style that was out there, that was published and written about, and we wanted to do that so that if the marketing team came to us and said, we'd like to have, some sort of German Bock or something like that, we'd have a recipe that we had already developed that we could use as a starting point. And so we did an India Pale Ale in the pilot brewery, and it was 6.5%. It was probably 55 or 60 IBUs. I remember it had Cascade and Columbus hops in it. It was an absolutely beautiful beer. And I was able to talk the team into sending a keg of that out to the Great American Beer Festival. And, and I was the one that had pushed for Anheuser-Busch to showcase their beers at the Great American Beer Festival. They never really got too involved with it before. And, I'd been to the Great American Beer Festival a bunch, and I'm like, we need to have a booth here.
Yeah.
And so I pushed for it and got it, and so we started sending beer out there. We started sending people out from the brewing teams out there to man the booths and things like that, and just kind of put a human face behind, the Anheuser-Busch beers. That was really the goal. And we served this beer one year, and it was the only time in the 3 or 4 years that I went there representing Anheuser-Busch that we had a line at the booth.
Yeah.
And we had brewers coming up to us and telling us it was an amazing beer. And I was really pumped about it. And we got back to St. Louis, and I said, I was in a meeting with the marketing group, and I said, all right, when are we going to make the IPA? What are we going to do with this? This beer was a home run. And they're like, yeah, we're not going to do that.
Yeah. Wow. That's brutal, man.
Yeah, that was a tough one. Yeah.
Yeah. What when you were putting together the Michelob specialty beers, and you were like working on the IPA at the time, how much of like sales education was going on? Like, were you out in market, like talking to reps about how to try to position this stuff? Like, what was Anheuser-Busch doing to support these releases?
Yeah, so they had a group of salespeople in key markets that were part of the specialty brewing group. So they had they were young people that were assigned to focus on these beers. And I don't remember how many markets there were, but Boston was one, Minneapolis was one, Seattle, Portland. Some of the hotbeds, San Francisco, hotbeds of craft beer. We had people there. And we bring those people into St. Louis and have tastings with them. And so they'd be armed with some information from the brewing side to go out there. I remember having a lot of meetings with wholesalers as well, and flying out and standing up in front of the wholesalers and tasting the beer and explaining what the beer was and how they should try to sell it and things like that. So it was on that level. But yeah, that was a big part of the job. It was a really big part of the job. And, and we took the opportunity when we'd go out to Boston or we'd go to Denver or we'd go to, San Francisco or wherever to get around and taste the beers that were popular out there.
Sure.
Which I didn't mind at all,
Yeah, it's a good part of the job right there.
Yeah, that was a fun part.
How of the, the vaunted Red Network, all these Anheuser-Busch distributors, there's always, they're not a monolith, right? Most of them, the vast majority of them are independent businesses besides the wholly owned distributors that Anheuser-Busch owns. But some of them are more forward thinking than others. I mean, that's true today of any distributor, not just of Anheuser-Busch distributors. Some Molson Coors or Constellation distributors are really kind of thinking about what's next. Some really just kind of want to drop the pallet and move on, keep on doing exactly what they're doing. What was your finding from the middle tier, from your partners in the middle tier at that time? How many of them were really pulling for craft beer because they believed in it versus how many just knew they had to get some of it in their book because that's what they were being asked for. Like what level of buy-in do you remember from the middle tier?
It depended on the location.
Yeah.
I think obviously, places like Denver and Seattle where the craft beer was eating into the sales of the distributors, it was a pretty big deal. And you'd run into people in the companies that were pretty well versed in craft beer, but not a lot. Not a lot. I mean, most people just looked at it as something that they needed to be competitive.
Yep.
And, and there was different levels of how, people that really wanted to learn about it. And it was pretty fun, when you had a group of people in a room that really asked a lot of great questions and really wanted to understand, how we approached making the beer and, how it was different or similar to a brand that was really doing well in their market and how they could approach selling it. You could tell when when you walk into the room, you can tell which rooms were really engaged and which ones were just kind of there because they had to be.
Right.
And, and with those ones, you just tried to get through it as fast as possible. You tried to build up a little excitement, but you could tell if it wasn't working.
Yeah.
And, but in general, I think it was kind of, there were smatterings of people on the distributor level that were really very excited about it.
Mm-hmm. Mitch, I want to switch gears in the last sort of few minutes. You've gone the distance here. This has been a tremendous episode already. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about something that we've talked about on this show with a bunch of different guests from different angles. We talked with Ryan Burke, who worked on Angry Orchard. We talked with Keith Villa, who worked on Blue Moon, of course. And a dynamic that I'm fascinated by. I've covered the business for a dozen years or so I'm not nearly as senior as yourself. I don't have the experience that you do, but I've seen sort of how things have evolved. When I came onto the beat here, covering the beer industry, it was sort of the right before what I think in hindsight would be, the crescendo of the David versus Goliath narrative that took hold and I think was really compelling for a lot of drinkers. This idea that, craft means anti-corporate and therefore has a moral high ground, and I'm going to drink craft to support local businesses. You've seen it from many different sides. You have experience that very few other people do. You've seen it from the brew pub level. I think you worked at a winery at one point.
I did. When I got out of school, I worked wine.
You've seen the very agricultural side of beverage alcohol with winemaking. Then you come work for the quote unquote evil empire. A lot of folks had a lot of bad things to say about Anheuser-Busch during when I got on the beat in the 2010s. A lot of craft brewers, really Anheuser-Busch at that point, I guess, would be InBev. Anheuser-Busch InBev was a real punching bag, I think, for a lot of folks. And some of that criticism was deserved. Some of it, I think, was very overblown. I'm curious whether any of that was do you remember it being an adversarial relationship when you were working there in the late 90s, in the mid to late 90s? Like, what was the David and Goliath thing as animated as it would become 15 years later?
Yes.
It was.
It was. So I'll tell a quick story. It was a craft brewers conference in Seattle, and I don't remember which Portland brewery this gentleman worked for. He gave up and gave a speech, and he had the film clips from Star Wars and Darth Vader, and he was equating Darth Vader with Anheuser-Busch. It was right when Anheuser-Busch was really starting to get into it. And honestly, in my 3 to 4 years of doing new products with Anheuser-Busch, one of my main internal goals was, to stay involved in craft because that's where my heart was, but also to make people realize who are very critical of Anheuser-Busch that the brewing people at Anheuser-Busch are as passionate about beer as anybody, and beer flavor and beer quality, and whether it's a Budweiser beer or whether it's an Elk Mountain Amber Ale, the passion was there, and we weren't just this faceless bunch of robots, pushing buttons in a brewery. There was real craftsmanship going on there, and it was a very tough battle. I remember we came back from that craft brewers conference in Seattle just completely devastated, right? I mean,
Sure.
at least, we were really upset.
Because you consider these people your peers.
Yeah. And it was very tough, So, we made a concerted effort to just try and humanize who we were as a company. And, and we had bits of success. We were volunteering to do educational seminars at the Craft Brewers Conference and tastings of off flavors and things like that. And just trying to, be part of the rising tide, a little bit. But, that being said, once you get out into our sales and distribution network, it was brutal. And Anheuser-Busch people were brutal in what they did to get sales and to stomp out their competitors and other craft brewers.
Yeah.
And so I understand it, I do. But, from the brewing side of things, we tried to, bridge the gap a little bit.
Yeah. Do you feel like you were successful in bridging the gap? This stuff always really interests me because, having covered this for a while, I'm persuaded by the idea that, corporations certainly are not monoliths. Neither are all craft brewers. Some craft brewers have much more nuanced understandings of the corporations that they go out and compete against for tap handles or for shelf space or whatever. Some, even to this day, although it's definitely less of a thing these days because I think a lot more craft brewers are living a little bit more hand to mouth than maybe they were, and they have bigger fish to fry than worrying about what the bigs are doing. But I'm always like, the thing that really I always get curious about is, you took on this concerted effort. How much was it well received within the company? I think that's something that a lot of times craft brewers themselves don't have as much insight to, and certainly craft beer drinkers and enthusiasts, many of whom are the ones that carried these torches or carried these pitchforks even more aggressively than the brewers sometimes. People have very little window into the institutional thinking from the supposedly big bad Anheuser-Busch. How much uptake was there for your efforts?
Oh, I think it had an impact. I think people, recognized what we were doing. We would have meetings with beer writers and things like that. The marketing team was 100% behind it. The one thing that really, and just sitting in meetings and seeing August Busch III in action, the one thing that really lit him up was when some of these comments came out and said, they implied that the beer was not a high quality beer. And he would get so fired up about that, and
I bet.
So it was a battle. Whether what I was actually trying to do was what they wanted to do as a company. I think for a while it was. I think in the end, they kind of backed off of it a little bit. And when I stayed with Anheuser-Busch for a few years after I left the new products group, but I saw cycles of engagement and then separation, with that kind of thing. And, it's like, yes, we're going to be at the Craft Brewers Conference or we're going to be at the Great American Beer Festival. And then, no, we're not going to go there. It's a waste of time, So I saw a lot of that, kind of going back and forth, depending on who was in charge and who had the floor at the time. So,
which speaks to what you were describing before with the cyclical nature of working with the marketer. I mean, these are how corporate priorities shift and cycle, and you've got to be ready to roll with the tides, I suppose.
Yeah. And then Anheuser-Busch, got into the mode of buying into craft breweries because, they realized that a lot of consumers weren't going to drink a craft beer no matter how good it was if they knew it was made by Anheuser-Busch. And so the investments into some of the breweries in the Pacific Northwest started towards the end of my time there.
This would have been what was now most recently called the Craft Brewers Alliance, CBA. It was always called CBA, I suppose. Yeah,
it was Red Hook and then Widmer. And then and then there were some others that Anheuser-Busch was looking at that I got involved in doing some due diligence on. But that was kind of admission that the general public who drank microbrews or craft beer, however you wanted to call it back then, if they saw Anheuser-Busch on the label, they were going to pass.
Yeah. And Red Hook in particular, I think maybe it was just an organic grassroots campaign, or maybe it was Boston Beer Company, because Jim Koch was a longtime antagonist of August Busch III and the Anheuser-Busch operation. But people started calling it Bud Hook after that acquisition. So this was very I think listeners these days are familiar and maybe even a little bit, exhausted by the idea of, craft versus corporate, that dynamic, right? I mean, but they've been absorbing that for the last 10, 15 years, but that was a very live issue at that time.
Oh, it was very contentious and very fueled with a lot of anger. And I don't think that was undeserved, because I think Anheuser-Busch's, their practices out in retail were, frankly, very hard to deal with.
Notoriously
if you were small,
sharp
independent.
elbowed.
Yeah. And so I just, that was a battle I couldn't fight. That was not anything I could ever speak to or get involved with.
Yeah.
But, so I just tried to deal with it with what I could deal with, which is the brewing side and the brewing technology side.
Yeah. I heard a journalist once who had worked at the New York Times. He had gotten a piece of advice from a journalist who was much older than him, who had worked at the Times his whole life. And he said, have a blast. Like, it's the best place to work. Just don't try to change anything. Right.
Yeah.
You tried to change some things at this big institution that you were working at. And it sounds like you had you feel like you had at least a little bit of success in doing that, although I imagine it, like everything, it sounds like it maybe was a mixed bag with some of that. By way of wrapping up, I would love if you indulge me, like, reflect on that for a moment. What do you think your time at Anheuser-Busch, not to be too much gravitas here, but what do you think you accomplished while you're at Anheuser-Busch?
Oh my gosh.
Sum it up in 2 sentences, Mitch.
Yeah. I look at that time as a real special time, in my career, because I was able to do something that very few people have been able to do, and that's create new beers at a company like Anheuser-Busch. And I was given a fair amount of freedom, really. We did some things that I don't think if I hadn't been there, we would have done, and I feel really good about it. We didn't get as far as we wanted to, but we had some successes, and we built some bridges, and I think established some goodwill with the brewing community, and certainly personally I did. I know I made a lot of friends in the craft brewing industry in my time at Anheuser-Busch. And so I look back at that as a huge success for me personally. Mm-hmm. And I got to know a lot of really great people in the beer industry. So it was, it was a very tough environment. You had a lot of roadblocks and that kind of thing. But I think I navigated it reasonably well, and I accomplished some neat things. So, I look back at it very positively. There's some fun stories that came out of it, and there's some really bad stories that came out of it, and there's also some really great stories. So, it's kind of like life. It's not everything's going to be great, but you take what you take from it. And I worked with a lot of really talented people. I just loved being in corporate brewing and talking to the brewmasters that have been trained in Germany and getting their opinions on things. I learned so much.
Some of the best, as you said, some of the best in the world.
Yeah. It was amazing.
Yeah. Wow. What an experience. I think that's a great place to leave it. Mitch Steele, thank you so much for joining us on Taplines today, going down memory road from Fort Collins to St. Louis, and then out to San Diego after that, right? Stone came next.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mitch, thanks so much for joining us.
All right, Dave. Thanks a lot.
All right. Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire VinePair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mallon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sciarrino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes, you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.